should be live on the YouTube channel.
Ready? Hello, I'm Dave Anderson. I serve as chair of the Master's Level Psychology Licensed Clinical Psychotherapy Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to signify their presence at this open meeting that is being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic meeting. Donna Honer-Queel, who we know is not going to be.
I believe she is absent today.
Travis Hammer.
I don't see Travis on the conference call, and I'll let you know if he logs on.
Very good. Rebecca Jabara,
I am here.
Lauren Luck,
I do not see her on the Zoom as well.
Iris Pauly,
Do you need David to speak a little bit louder?
Yeah.
Okay.
sorry. Thank you.
Thanks.
Josh Hangaway. Kari Wolf.
Present.
I note the following BSRB staff members are also present. David Fye
Here.
Leslie Allen.
I believe Leslie is on the call, that she stepped away from her computer.
Next, David Fye will read a message concerning this meeting being held remotely.
This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns with the Kansas Open Meeting Act, where COMA does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting, as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and by watching the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the COMA are not suspended, so we will be conducting this meeting pursuant to the COMA. And I wanted to let you know, Travis Hamrick has logged onto the meeting, so he is present now as well. On December 13th, 2022, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of advisory committee meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, bsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and the YouTube channel that allows the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And we did test the conference call before the meeting began. There was no one on the conference call, but we will request identification if someone logs onto the meeting that way.
Thank you. As we do not currently have a quorum, we will not be able to take formal action. We will, however, be able to discuss items on our agenda. So I will ask if anybody has any items they'd like to add to the agenda for discussion today.
Yeah.
And we cannot approve our minutes, that's correct, right?
Correct.
So I guess that moves us right to the executive director's report.
Okay. And it has been a little bit of time since the last time the advisory committee met. I believe your meeting was right before the board's offsite planning meeting in October. So I have a number of updates from that meeting, as well as the board's full meeting on November 14th. So first from that board's offsite planning meeting on October 24th, the board discussed different options, potentially having outside companies perform certain reviews of applicants. And these are primarily individuals who attended a school that is not accredited by the national accrediting body. For those individuals that do attend a program that's accredited by a national accrediting body, we can expedite licensure for those individuals. But Kansas includes some flexibility to allow more individuals to meet the standards for licensure. However, to do the analysis of those alternate standards, sometimes we have to bring in experts to review those materials. And so we have a number of experts that we have utilized here in Kansas. And we are still seeking to grow that pool. But there's a company called the Center for Credentialing and Education, CCE, that works with about 5 other states doing certain reviews for them. And the board has received information from them. The board is supportive of exploring that option and is seeking to look at potentially RFP language or another process to go ahead and see if they would be a good fit for the BSRB for the future. Additionally, the board previously had held license hearings before the full board when an individual had been denied for licensure and requested a hearing. But to work on the logistics of having those hearings scheduled more quickly, the board determined to go ahead and begin using hearing panels of 5 board members for those hearings. The hearing panels would be composed of a board member for that profession, if one was on the board, as well as a public member, and then the remaining 3 members could be any other board members. The board is supportive of looking into utilization of an impaired provider program for some other agencies here in the state of Kansas and some similar agencies in other states. They do utilize a program by which licensees are able to seek assistance if they are struggling with mental health impairment or substance use impairment. And so if that occurs, in some other states, they're able to utilize a program called an Impaired Provider Program and get temporary assistance through that program. Other jurisdictions also use it as an alternative to certain forms of disciplinary actions. So that it's another method the board has to assist those licensees who are dealing with some issues along those lines. The board is potentially looking at RFP language from different companies that provide those services to get an idea of what companies could be able to provide to licensees under the BSRB in terms of impaired provider programs. And Lauren Lucht, I believe, has entered the call as well, so she is present too. The board at that October 24th meeting looked at license reciprocity requirements. There is, for most of the professions under the BSRB, there is a standard statute that describes the process that must be followed for individuals to qualify for licensure through reciprocity. However, the legislature in Kansas passed a bill during the 2021 legislative session that applies to military members, military spouses, individuals that reside in Kansas, and some select other individuals. And if they qualify under that statute, that was passed and now is statute, they have an expedited licensure, and there is an alternative pathway for them to qualify for reciprocity. So the board asked the advisory committees to look at the statutory language for reciprocity to see if possible changes could be appropriate for that regular statute for reciprocity. Additionally, the board was looking at ways to assist individuals who may wish to practice, who had allowed their license to expire sometime in the past. These could be individuals who decided to leave the workforce because of something to do with their own health or someone close to them or another reason. And the board was looking at addressing the topic of workforce issues. And one way that could address that would be to provide motivation to those individuals or make it easier for them to come back to become licensed again if they are no longer licensed to practice. And so the board had a discussion on different methods that could be considered. What the board was supportive of would be to move forward with language that would essentially, if someone had a license that had been expired for over a year, they would be able to have the license reinstated for half the current cost. Currently, you would have to have a license fee plus a reinstatement fee equal to the license fee. So they would drop the cost to become licensed again by half. And also to become licensed again, you would need to get all of your continuing education hours from the past license period. And the board recommended introduction of language to create a new type of temporary license. So individuals who have not made up all of those hours, but wish to start working before they have completed those hours, could apply to the board for a short-term new temporary license so that they could begin working while taking those hours. And then once they had completed all of those hours, they could apply to the board for full reinstatement of the permanent license. So we are moving forward on those items. Additionally, the board recommended changes for the behavior analyst profession. There is currently not a board member for the behavior analyst profession. And the board recommended introduction of language to be put into a bill before the legislature this year to add a 13th board member for the behavior analyst profession. And so that would need to be passed by the legislature to become law. Additionally, there is language in the behavior analyst statute that deals with disciplinary remedies that is very different from the rest of those statutes for the other professions. It limits the ability of the BSRB and the board to issue things like a public censure or a small fine. And so the remedies that are available are fairly extreme, such as suspending a license or revoking a license. And so the board was supportive of changing that language to make it more in line with the rest of the professions. Additionally, the board requested introduction of language to create a new type of license for individuals who apply for a social work license from a program that is in candidacy for accreditation from the Council on Social Work Education. That's the accrediting body for the social work profession. You do have an accrediting process that can take 3 to 3.5 years. And so for new programs that are starting, specifically online programs, they may not meet the alternative requirements for licensure in Kansas. But what this new language would do, if it's passed by the legislature, is it would create a new type of temporary license for individuals who graduate from these programs that are in candidacy for accreditation. And they could apply for a temporary license from the board. And if they receive this temporary license, they could practice for a year, and that license could be renewed if their program remained in candidacy. If the program reaches full accreditation, they would be able to get a permanent license from the board. Additionally, the Social Work Advisory Committee had made a recommendation to the board to add a new 3-hour requirement in the area of continuing education and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the board had a robust discussion on the current requirements for continuing education for the professions. Currently, for all licensees, there is a requirement of 3 hours of ethics for every 2-year license period. Additionally, for the levels of licensure that are able to diagnose and treat, they are required to get 6 hours of diagnosis and treatment. In comparing our requirements to those in other states, the 3 hours in ethics is pretty standard. However, the requirement of continuing education and diagnosis and treatment is a bit unusual compared to what other states require. Some states do require specific topics, but that appears to be one that Kansas requires that's a bit different from most other jurisdictions. So what the board was supportive of doing in this area was to recommend language for the legislature to make a change to continuing education requirements across the board for all professions. And this would be to decrease the number of continuing education hours for diagnosis and treatment every license period from 6 hours to 3 hours, and to add a new requirement of 3 hours in cultural diversity. And the language for that new 3-hour requirement would match current language that's in place in Texas for the licensed psychology profession. For those individuals who are not able to diagnose and treat based on their level of license, it would be a new 3-hour requirement in cultural diversity, continuing education hours every license period. So that will need to go before the legislature for approval, but that was the recommendation of the board at that meeting. Additionally, the board voted to make a change to the professional counseling regulations in KAR 102-3-3A. Those are the requirements that discuss program requirements for licensure. And the language previously had indicated that for someone to qualify for licensure, they would need to have a degree in professional counseling or a related field. However, the requirements for the program indicated the person directing or chairing the program had to be someone with a doctorate in professional counseling and did not allow for them to have a doctorate in a related field. And so the decision by the board at the October 24th meeting was to introduce new regulatory language to change that to allow the person directing or leading the program to hold a doctoral degree in professional counseling or a related field. And that term related field is defined in the regulations for the profession. Additionally, the board had discussion on records of deceased practitioners. This has been a discussion for the last 2 years for the board. There are about maybe a handful of times per year the BSRB is contacted by individuals where records may have been abandoned or a solo practitioner may have ceased practicing, and the question is how to handle the transfer of these records or what can be done. And so we looked at other states. The decision by the board in terms of how to deal with this in a way that could be helpful without becoming too involved in this process would be to look at adding language to the unprofessional conduct regulations for the profession to indicate that it would be a practitioner's responsibility to make sure that there is a custodian of records should they pass away unexpectedly or be unavailable to be the custodian of their own records. This would not apply to practitioners that worked at a company that is the custodian of those records. But the first thing the board would recommend adding language to that unprofessional conduct regulation to make sure that practitioners were aware that it was our responsibility to go ahead and identify an alternate custodian for the records. And then we could move forward once that's in place with adding questions on the renewal application to seek clarity in terms of who that custodian would be to provide assistance if that becomes an issue in the future. So that is the direction the board had recommended on that topic. At the board meeting on November 14th, 2022, the board heard a presentation on a professional counseling multi-state compact. This was by representative of the Kansas Counseling Association. This is a compact that has been before state legislatures the last 2 years. The first year was passed by 2 states. This last year is passed by an additional 15 more. So they have reached the threshold to begin meeting for that commission. That language has not come before the Kansas legislature, but the Kansas Counseling Association indicated to the board that they would be requesting introduction of that language, and they requested that the board be supportive of that language if it is brought forward in bill form this year. And so the board determined to take the time between the November meeting and the January meeting to study the compact further, and then to be ready to discuss whether the board would be supportive of that compact at the January board meeting. Additionally, there was a bill that passed during the 2021 legislative session establishing the Kansas Fights Addiction Grant Review Board. And this is a group of individuals that are appointed by different individuals and entities to oversee a lot of money that the state of Kansas receives through federal litigation and lawsuits involving opioid companies. And so the BSRB is named as an entity that was able to appoint a permanent member to that. And the board had expressed that they would like to have a permanent appointee who had past experience treating addictions. And they had opened that up to the advisory committees, and the advisory committee members had the opportunity to submit interest. And the board reviewed those that submitted interest and selected Jason Hess to be the new appointee on the Kansas Fights Addiction Grant Review Board. So really excited that Jason volunteered for that, and the board appointed him. I think he'll do a great job on that grant review board, and looking forward to his work with that. The board has also been working this past fall on changes to the investigation policy. The board is charged to not only review the license applications, but also to oversee complaints against practitioners. And they are guided by an investigation policy. That policy had not been updated for several years. So the board went through a process of reviewing changes that were brought forward by BSRB staff and also investigators, the BSRB and legal counsel for the board, and completed those changes at that November 14th meeting. Additionally, the board was looking at KAR 102-1-15G. That is a regulation that was unique to the licensed psychology profession that allowed those individuals, when they came up upon the expiration of their license, if they had not completed all of their continuing education hours needed to renew their license, and they had good cause for showing why they needed more time to complete the hours, in regulation, they have the ability to request to the BSRB additional time to complete the hours. And there was authority in the regulation to provide up to 6 months. We have brought that before the board, and the advisory committees had discussed whether that would be helpful for other professions. At that November 14th board meeting, the board agreed that this should be a helpful item to include for each of the professions with some changes. One would be that the amount of time to complete those hours should be reduced from 6 months to 3 months, no longer than 3 months. The standard for review should be changed from good cause to extenuating circumstances, and some language should be added that individuals cannot utilize this in back-to-back license periods. So we will be taking steps to move forward on putting some language in place so that individuals from all licensees or all professions can use the provisions of that regulation. And we hope that that will be a helpful way to allow more individuals to stay licensed if they're continuing to practice, but something extreme came up that prevented them from completing those hours on time, such as their own health or someone close to them or something like that. Additionally, several of the professions recommended and the board voted to approve the removal of language for the license or program requirements. So there is currently language in the alternative pathways for licensure that required at least a certain amount of coursework to be received in residence. And the definition of in residence included that some of those hours had to be while physically present at the institution. For the number of programs that are starting that are online programs, this was going to be very challenging, if not impossible to meet. And so the addiction counseling, marriage and family therapy, and social work professions made a recommendation to the board to remove the requirement that a student had to be physically present at the institution, and also to add language that the requirement of face-to-face contact in front of core faculty could be met either in person or by screen. And so those were recommended by the board. Since that time, the Professional Counseling Advisory Committee has also made a recommendation along those lines as well, and that will be considered by the board at the board meeting tomorrow. There have been a couple of legislative updates I want to make you aware of. We did implement a series of regulations that have been going through that process most of this past year. They were voted upon by the board at the November 14th board meeting to approve those changes to the regulations. And those were published in the Secretary of State's publication and Kansas Register. And so those are now effective, and they are listed on the BSRB website, and a message was sent to all licensees about those changes to the regulations as well. We also went before a Joint Committee on Administrative Rules and Regulations and answered questions concerning those changes to regulations. And I recently provided testimony to a special legislative committee on mental health beds on December 21st. They are focused on topics involving workforce as they relate to staffing for the beds. And I mentioned some of the different conversations and the work that the board is doing to try to assist with workforce issues in terms of creating new different types of licenses, in terms of helping individuals who are currently licensed maintain their license, and then also providing motivation or assistance for individuals who have let their license expire, come back and become licensed again. So a lot of those comments were met with support. And I've had some conversations with members of the legislature after that time as well. We will be moving forward after the board meeting tomorrow and requesting legislation before the 2023 legislature. And so when that happens, we will likely send a letter out or an email out to all licensees, letting them know what are the items that the board has recommended be put into a bill. So that way members of the community will be able to know what items will be in a bill before the legislature this coming spring. And then one other item I wanted to update the advisory committee on. So I have tried to provide some updates specifically as they relate to disciplinary matters for your profession. Each year, the BSRB receives complaints against all practitioners. This fiscal year, since July 1st of 2022, the BSRB has received 97 complaints against all practitioners. And this is out of 14,779 total licensees. Out of this total, 9 LMLPs, the master's level psychologists, and 4 licensed clinical psychotherapists. And this was basically using their primary license to avoid double counting. But there essentially have been 9 complaints against master's level psychologists and 4 complaints against licensed clinical psychotherapists. There are currently 315 LMLPs and 276 LCPs in Kansas, just for context. And so proportional to the number of licensees for each profession, the master's level psychologists are receiving the highest number of complaints currently, though it is 9 out of 315 licensees. And it should be noted that complaints and violations are very different. The second most common profession that has been receiving complaints are the licensed psychologist, followed by the licensed clinical psychotherapist, and then the clinical level of the marriage and family therapy profession. So we're about halfway through the fiscal year. So those numbers are on track for what we saw last fiscal year in terms of the total number of complaints. But I just wanted to provide a little bit more detail in terms of complaints against professionals in your profession. So with that, I'll go ahead and end my report, and I can stand for any questions.
Thank you, Dave. Any questions? Now that we have a quorum, shall we? Hi, Lauren.
Good afternoon. I'm sorry I was tardy.
Oh, you're fine. We had proceeded prior to your coming aboard without a quorum, so we hadn't taken any official action. So we're going to back up on our agenda, and I'll ask for a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Thank you. A second.
I second.
Very good. We have a motion and a second. Do we have any further discussion? Seeing none, all in favor of the motion, please say aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Okay, motion passes. Thank you. Lauren, did you have anything you wanted to add to the agenda?
Nope, I didn't. Thank you.
We'll move to a review and approval of the minutes. Has everybody had an opportunity to review the minutes?
Yes.
I'd entertain a motion for the approval of the minutes of the October 19th, 2022 meeting.
So
So
moved.
moved.
Okay, Lauren moved. Second.
Second.
All right, thank you. We have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Same sign. Motion. Yes, thank you. That then moves us to old business. We're going to start with a finalized recommendation in regard to changes to unprofessional conduct regulation.
Yeah, so last year, each of the advisory committees was asked to review the language in the unprofessional conduct regulation for your profession. For the master's level psychology profession, the language was in KAR 102-4-12. So in your packet of material, you should see two handouts. One is a copy of the regulation itself, 102-4-12. And then the other document is a table. And what I have done is I have looked at the discussion that took place throughout the meetings last year on changes to the professional conduct regulation. And in some cases, there was a recommendation, but in a lot of instances, there was discussion, but perhaps not a formal recommendation. So what I have done is on the left, I have listed the current regulation, and then on the right, I have noted potentially a proposed change. And then at the bottom, I tried to put down what I believe the advisory committee was supportive of, or if there was a possible recommendation, I tried to highlight that. And so this would be open for discussion today. There also could be items that were not previously discussed if you have any additional comments, but your recommendations today will be forwarded to the board, and then the board will have the opportunity to review recommendations from each of the advisory committees, and then to discuss those. It would take a board vote to approve any change to the unprofessional conduct regulations, but this would be the opportunity for the advisory committee to make recommendations to the board on changes to this language. So we can go ahead and walk through some of those. And would you like me just to talk about them, or would you like me to pull up the table with the language?
Do you all have that information in front of you, or would you like it pulled up?
I've got it pulled up.
I'll go ahead and I'll pull up that the table. Okay, and I will go ahead and share my screen so that you can see the table here. Okay, so you should be seeing an Excel document here. On the left, as I mentioned, is the language of the current regulation. And then after reviewing the minutes from the meetings that took place last year, I went ahead and took the comments that I thought were reflective of the advisory committee's position. On some of these, there was not a change, but I thought there was enough discussion. I wanted to verify that there was no recommended change. So I'll go ahead and walk through these. And if there is no recommended change, we don't need to discuss these items, but if there is some comment or discussion, feel free to go ahead and begin speaking. With the screen shared this way, I may not be able to see if you have a hand raised or something else. So the first regulation had to do with KAR 102-4-12B 2D. And essentially what that regulation is it says any of the following acts by a licensed master's level psychologist, a licensed clinical psychotherapist, or any applicant for licensure at the master's level of psychology shall constitute unprofessional conduct. And then under 2, it says, except when such information has been obtained in the context of confidentiality, failing to notify the board within a reasonable period of time that any person regulated by the board or applying for license or registration, including oneself, has met any of the following conditions. D, has been convicted of a crime. And when that item came up in terms of discussion, it was noted that some of the other professions include the word felony rather than conviction of a crime. And it was questioned whether that should remain conviction of a crime or if it should be changed to felony. I can tell you some of the discussion from the other advisory committees is that there are times where potentially a felony could be pled to a different level of crime. And there may be some other types of non-felonies that would relate to practice. So in terms of notifying the board, it may be helpful to keep this language involved, including it being a crime instead of just saying felony. This also does not mean that committing that crime or being convicted of the crime would constitute unprofessional conduct. It merely says that failing to notify the board of that item could be considered unprofessional conduct. So there is a difference there. It's really more about notifying the board of that item. And in some situations, it would not be unprofessional conduct, but it could be helpful for the board to have that information to be able to evaluate that. So just kind of wanted to bring it up and see if there were any additional thoughts from the advisory committee on that.
I agree with reporting of any crime. It's just more information. And certainly if it wasn't applicable, then action wouldn't be taken. But I think being transparent with your board and explaining, normally it says, if you've had a felony, please explain. I think, people would still have the opportunity to explain the crime, but we wouldn't be limiting ourselves to just what might have been something pled down to a lower crime.
Other feedback?
No, I agree with Lauren. I think the more information we have, the better. And then, if it's decided that it's not investigatable or it's not worthy of investigation, then that is fine. But I would rather, since our job is to protect our community, that we err on that side of caution.
Well, it sounds like it's the consensus of the advisory committee to leave that language the way that it currently states. So no recommended change on that item.
Just checking because we can't see you all to make sure. Anybody have any dissenting opinion?
No, if I see lots of head shaking, no.
We can't see your head shaking, so we will assume silence means that you agree. But do, as Dave said, feel free to jump in, because if you raise your hand or motion somehow that you would like to make a comment, we're not necessarily going to be able to see.
Travis has his mic off, so I think he might have something to add.
Oh, I was just gonna specify, you're talking misdemeanors and felonies, not traffic violations. Doesn't seem petty, but they're considered a crime as well. But
That's a good point.
Yeah, I think the intent is to make sure that the board is aware of the crimes that are significant of nature. But I think in terms of actually clarifying that language and figuring out exactly what to be clear, I'm not sure where to draw the line. So I think that's probably why it was just left at crime instead of another term.
So I wonder if conviction is a stipulated difference between the fact that somebody was ticketed for a traffic violation versus.
Yeah, you
Correct.
can plead guilty to a traffic violation, and depending on how egregious the violation is, going 90 and a 35, you're probably going to need to do diversion with some additional. There's different levels of even traffic violations. I think keeping the word convicted of a crime just keeps it open, convicted of anything. And of course, a low level traffic violation wouldn't concern us. your judgment might be questionable if you routinely drive 100 miles an hour on your way home from work.
Very good.
Well, let's move on to the second item there, and that is KAR 102-4-12 B7. The existing current language says knowingly aiding or abetting anyone who is not credentialed by the board to represent that individual as a person who is credentialed by the board. And the advisory committee had discussed whether to continue to use the term credentialed rather than licensed. Advisory committee members discussed the term credentialed seems to be more relevant to the insurance community rather than discussions by the regulatory board. So I thought about this language. One alternative that I thought may be helpful would be, instead of using the word credentialed, perhaps replace the word credentialed with authorized to practice. So that it would say it would be a violation of unprofessional conduct if someone knowingly aided or abetted anyone who is not authorized to practice by the board to represent that individual as a person who is authorized to practice by the board.
Is there a reason licensed isn't used to replace credential?
So there are other types of ways that we can authorize practice. There is an out-of-state temporary permit.
Okay.
And so I think using a broad term would make sure that we don't inadvertently exclude some people like that.
Right. Comments?
No, no comment.
Hearing none, I'm going to assume that means that the committee approves of that change.
No one's opposing on video.
So I think in the minutes, I'll just have down that by consensus, the advisory committee was supportive of making that change, unless there's any objections.
Okay.
I'll move on to item number 3. That is KAR 102-4-12 B10. The current language says it would be unprofessional conduct to offer to perform or performing services clearly inconsistent or incommensurate with one's training, education, experience, or with accepted professional standards. The advisory committee members discussed whether to add language to this regulation specifically to address providing services via telehealth. So I thought about those comments, and as one possible solution, I thought about adding additional language, including but not limited to telehealth, that would at least spotlight that topic. To just let people know that it's not limited to telehealth in terms of this regulation, but we do want individuals to make sure they're performing services within professional standards as it relates to telehealth as well as other practices.
I support that.
Anybody have concerns about that?
No,
No concerns.
Okay,
And I apologize for the misspelling. That additional language should say including but not limited to telehealth. So there's a T missing, but I'll go ahead and correct that. Okay. We'll move on to the next one, item number 4. So this was a combination of 2 unprofessional conduct regulations, KAR 102-4-12 B13 and also 14. 13 says failing to advise and explain to each client the respective rights, responsibilities, and duties involved in the professional relationship. 14 states failing to provide each client with a description of what the client can expect in the way of services, consultation, reports, fees, billing, therapeutic regimen, or schedule, or failing to reasonably comply with the description. And the advisory committee members discussed the value of providing information on procedures, especially related to telehealth, including when technology fails. No official recommendation was made, but there was discussion on this item, so I wanted to bring it back before the advisory committee to see if there was any additional thoughts or proposed language that you might want to add for this item. Either 13 or 14.
I wonder if that's not an appropriate place to add
And can you scroll down a little bit for this one, please?
Did you say slow down a little bit?
No, scroll down a little bit, please.
Yes, definitely.
There we go.
I wondered if that's an appropriate place to add something about after hours crisis. Seems to fit in there as one of the things, one of the numerous things that people need to inform clients about, and it would keep us from then having to add a specific one.
Mhm.
Yeah, think having something, what that would look like, I don't know, but I think having something in regard to that would be beneficial, especially given the new suicide hotline and then just how each region of the state varies in regard to what they have access to. It might be beneficial to put something in there.
And literally just had a comma that said after hours crisis contacts. That
Yeah, it could almost be like a fault mode, right? So it's our responsibility to make sure that we're providing information on procedures, especially related to telehealth, when technology fails or other unexpected things like being out of the office. I mean, you could tack on there your responsibility after hours for your patients or what that plan looks like and that you've educated your patients to that plan.
because in literally all these situations, the end result would be if somebody felt like, hey, I didn't get what I needed.
Right, and it's unique, and it's unique in a telehealth environment because the patient's not there with you in the office, and so you don't have the ability to, if they, if they were to present in crisis and not be with you, but the technology fails, you'd want them to know what steps you would take as their provider. I think that's probably an important part of making sure we keep people safe is knowing what to do when unexpected things happen or your therapist or psychologist is not available.
Unusual enough, what we've experienced at the hospital isn't the patients that actually receive telehealth, it's the ones that weren't offered it. They're the ones that get upset, it seems, saying, why wasn't this service provided to me?
Mm.
So I do think it's helpful to clarify how it is that a patient is offered and why, why those patients have that available, because the ones that don't get the service seem to be the ones that become the most upset.
So just to clarify, Dave, you're talking about really adding the information related to telehealth to the other pieces that are already in this regulation.
Well, on this one, I tried to summarize some of the discussion. But there wasn't an official recommendation, but I thought the advisory committee might want to revisit this because of the conversation that was had.
Right, and the conversation is to add specific information on telehealth to the existing regulation, right? So does that make sense? What's on the right-hand side, we're talking about adding to what's on the left-hand side.
Yes, that makes sense.
Mhm.
And so we're talking about adding the issues related to telehealth into the current regulation, and also language around after hours crisis contacts. And to Travis's point, it would make sense if that language was in there. If people said, yeah, I don't do that service, or I do that service, and then go on to explain how that occurs, because although I think it's widely available from a lot of people, I'm sure there are folks who have independent practices that do not provide that particular service. Or there may be people who say, yeah, it's not something I've gotten any training in and feel comfortable with how to deal not only with the difference, as Lauren indicated, with dealing with people that aren't kind of in the same room with me, let alone all the technology issues that go along with providing services in that manner.
I was thinking something to the effect of availability of telehealth services. You can let them know if it's available or not available.
A lot of sirens going on outside, so if you can hear that. We're hoping the building's not on fire. Do you feel like you have what you need, or do you want some clarification?
Well, let me take a shot here. So but for item number 14, and feel free to offer any alternatives to this. What if the language were to say something like, failing to provide each client with a description of what the client can expect in the way of services, including availability of telehealth services, and what and what should occur when technology fails, something like that. I'm trying to figure out a way to also put in some language about after hours crisis contacts, and so I'm trying to put kind of both of those around that word of services, but that's kind of what I was thinking about.
It seems like including the availability of telehealth services, but I don't know how to fit that other piece about technology, because there's a lot of things that fall under telehealth there, whether we need to be that prescriptive.
What if we used wording like availability and limitations to using telehealth? Rated. That would then allow for some acknowledgement more specifically that, practices identifying if they offer it or don't. So it's really we want to make sure that our patients are aware of the pros and cons of telehealth if they're receiving it, and the potential limitations around, confidentiality if their kids are in the next room and hear that conversation. So I think if we thought of it as limitations, that might help our patients understand, or the community understand, what we're wanting to protect against.
So what about something like this? For 14, failing to provide each client with a description of what the client can expect in the way of services, including availability and limitations of using telehealth, and availability of after-hours crisis contacts. And then say consultation, reports, fees, billing, therapeutic regimen, and so forth.
I like
it.
that.
Yeah, I like it too.
Anybody have any concerns about that language?
Nope.
Nope, no concerns.
Okay. So there's no real change in that language for item 13. Do you have any thoughts on 13? Seems like the initial discussion kind of grouped those two together. And so if you don't have thoughts on 13, that's okay too. But all this language would just go into the recommendation for 14. So I just want to circle back around to it.
I think that's appropriate.
Okay. Well, then the last item on the first page, KAR 102-4-12B, included some notes about item 19, item 22, and item 23. Item 19 was failing to inform each client, supervisee, or student of the limits of client confidentiality, the purposes for which the information is obtained, and the manner in which the information may be used. Item 22 was failing to protect the confidences of, secrets of, or information concerning other persons when providing a client with access to that client's records. And item 23, failing to exercise due diligence in protecting the information regarding the confidences and secrets of the client from disclosure by the person in one's work or practice setting. And the advisory committee had discussed possible changes to these regulations related to the standard for confidentiality, given telehealth services in the home rather than services being provided in an office, but no official recommendation on a change to language was made. So I just kind of wanted to bring that back to the attention of the advisory committee to see if you want to adjust any language concerning telehealth for those items.
I was hoping if we covered it as one of the limitations right above, we wouldn't need to also add additional information here. But if we did add it, it would just be the limitations around confidentiality outside of an office setting that the practitioner doesn't control.
I assume.
I don't know. I mean, you're responsible for going over that regardless of the practice environment. So but it doesn't hurt to have it.
Does anybody else, in reading this, the current regulation where it says failing to protect the confidences of, secrets of, I wonder why secrets has to be also included.
Yeah, I think that is bizarre.
I find that to be kind of an odd use of language. The confidences of means that whatever they share there is going to be protected as is currently. kind of
Should
laid
really
out.
be failing to protect the confidentiality or information concerning other persons.
Yeah, I'm.
Secrets of seems a little outdated to our profession.
That's my thought exactly. It sends a really kind of odd being.
Yeah.
Odd talking about what it is we do, should be.
It seems a little bit out of sync with healthcare services. These are secrets when in reality, we're providing a health service, mental health or emotional health. So
Like Lawrence use of confidential information. Broader or kind of in sync with what it is that we say we're going to do. I would be very uncomfortable if somebody said, I'll protect your secrets.
Yes, I agree. It almost seems like this was meant to, because it's talking about, if your patient tells you something about someone else, you're also going to protect that other person's confidentiality. But really, that is all just confidentiality.
So I'm gonna read back kind of what I think the recommendation is here, but let me know if I don't have this down correctly. So the proposed change that's been discussed right now is on item 22, adjusting the language so that it would say failing to protect the confidential information concerning other persons, or failing to protect, not get rid of the word the, failing to protect confidential information concerning other persons when providing a client with access to that client's record.
Yeah,
That's better. Yeah.
same with 23.
That's better, but I'm confused. Why would we be showing one client access to another client's records and then need to keep secrets out of it? That I'm just now confused at the intent of the. I can't think of a time where I've shown one client another client's records or ever been asked to. that might be a conflict, like a dual relationship if I was.
I don't know if that means like if you had a release to provide information on a married couple. One couple signing a release allowing information to be shared with their spouse.
I think the rewording that we discussed is good. I didn't mean to clog up the conversation or the progress. I was just trying to think of when would I actually use that. But I'm sure there's examples that we would do that, and it doesn't hurt to say it.
The way I read it, it's a little bit different. When it says failing to protect the confidence of secrets of information concerning other persons when providing a client with access to that client's records. One thing we experience here is I'll often get an evaluation from a mental health center or from another hospital, and we don't provide third-party access. If the patient wants to look at the evaluation from another agency that sent it over to us in their records, they've got to request that report from that agency. So I read this as, even though it's it's a little confusing where it says a client with access, if other persons. I see other persons as perhaps the original person who did the evaluation wanted to keep it confidential. That way the patient doesn't go back and take their anger out on that clinician. But this seems like third-party access to me. I might be reading it wrong.
Well, the proposed change, with changing it to say failing to protect confidential information concerning other persons when providing a client with access to that client's records. I want to make sure that doesn't change the intent given this new conversation today. It seems to me that it would probably retain the same intent of the original regulation, but with cleaner language. But just kind of wanted to ask all of you for your opinion on that as well.
I agree with you. I think it cleans it up.
Yeah, it's clearly not very clear at this point, given we're all trying to figure out how and when.
See that they use the word secrets twice and we're all thrown off because that is odd language. I read this almost like also water cooler talk. Like you should not be going out. If you think about if you're living in a small town and you're talking about something anonymously to a colleague, but it's really not that anonymous due to the size of your town or due to something you said being known about one person in particular, and then that person repeating it as the quote unquote other person. But focusing on protecting the confidentiality, we can't go wrong with that expectation. And I think removing the word secrets, both of the times it's written, probably sounds like more current language to me.
For item 23, what would you think about a change to the language so that it would say failing to exercise due diligence in protecting confidential information of the client from disclosure by other persons in one's work or practice setting?
That works.
Good.
Seems like there is consensus to modify item 22 and item 23 with that new language. And then just to go ahead and keep the current language for item number 19.
Correct.
Then
Yes.
we can go ahead and move on to the next item here. And that is on the back of the or the second page. It's KAR 102-4-12B24. And that language currently in the regulation says engaging in professional activities, including billing practices and advertising involving dishonesty, fraud, deceit, or misrepresentation. This was an item that the investigators for the board had brought forward and said, when you're talking about professional activities, they don't believe the intent when this was written to only include billing practices and advertising. So they recommended adding some language that said, including but not limited to billing practices and advertising. And so that way it's not interpreted that it could only apply to those two, that it could apply to other things that are professional activities. So just kind of want to bring that before you. I think other advisory committees have recommended this change as well, but just wanted to make sure that this was something that you would be supportive of changing to.
Everybody comfortable with that?
Yes.
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 That one's simple and makes sense.
Good. The next item is KAR 102-4-12B27. And that is one that says making sexual advances towards, engaging in physical intimacies or sexual activities with, or exercising undue influence over any person who within the past 24 months has been one's client. And there was a fair amount of discussion about this item in front of the advisory committee. The advisory committee discussed whether to add student or supervisee in addition to client. I believe there is a separate unprofessional conduct regulation that involves when someone is the current client, current student, and current supervisee. So this is just a separate item. I think perhaps that was item number 26. Yes. So item number 26 says making sexual advances towards or engaging in physical intimacies or sexual activities with one's client, supervisee, or student. And then item 27 here says making sexual advances towards or engaging in physical intimacies or sexual activities or exercising undue influence over any person who within the past 24 months has been one's client. And so in terms of other advisory committees, there has been discussion on both sides of this. Seems like some of the consensus has been to keep length of time at 24 months. In terms of adding student or supervisee, I think most of the advisory committees have left this at the client. But I did want to bring it back before you to see if you have any additional recommendations on this item.
Is there a recommendation from this group around adding?
I would recommend we add adopt the same language.
To add.
I think it would be a dual relationship and conflict with the American Psychological Association's ethics guidelines. Right, is it not explicit that the relationship with the student would have to be more than 24 months out currently for the other professions?
In terms of
But everyone is now saying 24 months besides our discipline. Is that what I heard you say?
well, so I think there are a couple of disciplines who are recommending to the board making the standard never. There are some logistical challenges in that because someone might have entered into a relationship with someone while this was not, while there was a standard of 24 months. And so to change that to a standard of never would, it would make things a little bit complicated from an investigatory standpoint. in terms of those logistics, but majority of the advisory committees have discussed this and decided to keep it at 24 months. In terms of adding student or supervisee to the 24 months, I think most of them have left us at client, but it certainly could be added in terms of providing that 24-month time frame for someone who's been a student or a supervisee.
I'm curious for others' opinions.
I feel like we discussed this before. Has this come up like 6 months ago? I feel like we put in the student and supervisee before.
There was discussion, but there wasn't an official recommendation.
Okay,
So I didn't want to assume that was the consensus, and so I wanted to revisit it just to make sure what the advisory
okay.
committee position would be.
I like having that in there. Just, I feel like it kind of protects the student from feeling any kinds of pressure or anything like that. I feel like it would be a good thing to have in, but that's my opinion, to add in the student and supervisee.
I would agree.
I also agree.
Travis?
I agree.
And is it also the consensus to leave it at 24 months?
Yes, I think so.
I concur.
Yes.
Sorry,
Oh, yeah, I said yes.
thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. The next item is KAR 102-4-1236. And that is failing to maintain a record for each client that conforms to the following minimal requirements, and then it lists a series of requirements. The advisory committee discussed maintaining records for clients and whether telehealth language should be added to this regulation. So one item that I was looking at is under item H. It says indicates the date and nature of any professional service that was provided. And potentially there could be language added to item H to indicate whether sessions were provided in person or by another means, such as by telephone or electronic method.
I think it would be wise to include that. A lot of the funding sources are now requiring that as well, that we include it. And I think for good practice, it wouldn't hurt for us to actually do the same, just to have it within our policy.
I agree.
I agree as well. Makes sense.
I agree.
I think a lot of the programs will specify whether it was done online or not, but making sure that it's noted for sure I think is important.
Can I help on that one?
Oh, I agree.
Then I'll move on to item 45. This item was KAR 102-4-1245, supervising in a negligent manner anyone for whom one has supervisory responsibility. And the big item on this one was the use of the term negligent, which is more of a legal term. The advisory committee discussed whether to change the term negligent to harmful. And so one of the possible changes could be just to change that term negligent to harmful, which would take it sort of out of a possible realm that could say, well, we need a legal definition for this term negligent. But I think it really gets to what I believe the intent was behind this regulation. But I wanted to bring it before you to see if you had any other thoughts on that potential change, or if you were supportive of making that change.
I have a question. So when I think about negligent, that doesn't always mean that the patient was harmed, but the potential was there. And so I wonder if it should say potentially harmful, because just because it didn't harm the trainee doesn't make it okay to act in a way someone might refer to as negligent in your supervisory responsibility of them, right? Like, let's say you are providing supervision while intoxicated, just to pick something silly no one would do. Even if that didn't harm the trainee, it is still really unprofessional and probably not very ethical. So I wonder I wonder what others feel about potentially harmful.
Yeah, I think you're correct in terms of finding a way that would allow for somebody to make a decision about the behavior that's not outcome based, but that could have been
Mhm.
harmful. But it's kind of like driving impaired. You don't have to crash your car in order for it to be a really bad decision. So
Right. And you wouldn't want to then, I'm thinking, you know, if somebody has been, even if no harm has come, if people have reported that they've been supervising in a potentially harmful way, then it may not make sense for that person to be doing clinical supervision for folks.
And I think I read that as a supervisor who's not holding true to their end. Like they meet with you for 15 minutes and say, you know, log an hour or so. And I don't know if that's potentially harmful or if that's, I think I read that a little bit differently as well. Like, and I don't know how to put that, but not fulfilling their duties, which isn't educating, right? They're not educating their,
And it'd be harmful if you looked at it from the whole, you know, you could make an argument that it's harmful because at the end of their training, they're going to be less prepared, but that's not really how we think about harm in like the day-to-day world. So I think potentially harmful behavior, potentially harmful practices or something to get at that. Because that would be potentially harmful to turn everyone's hour-long supervision into a 10 minutes.
right. Well, and it could be frustrating for whoever, you know, when they're trying to learn and your supervisor's not actively educating and helping you with those types of things.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not quite sure how to put that. It's almost like they won't know what they don't know.
Yeah. Conduct not consistent with.
yeah, unprofessional is one of the ways it's described. Trying to look up a synonym for that.
Yeah, unprofessional.
What if it says something like supervising in an unprofessional and or potentially harmful manner?
Yeah,
Because it does cover both areas and both are equally as important.
I like that.
yeah, I do too.
Travis?
Well, I'm trying to think from the supervisee perspective. Let's say you found a supervisor who agreed to take you on in your clinical supervision, and you pay them or they're part of your organization, and then they just they're gone half the time, and you get done with your 2000 or something 2 years of required supervision, and they haven't provided anything. You know, as a supervisee, if you want to make a complaint, what is it that you have to prove? Do you have to prove that this person was intentionally negligent, that they caused you harm because now you have to, ask for an extension, or, from the injured party's perspective, what is it that they're going to be required to show in order to show that they were wronged by the supervisee or the supervisor? And I think if you leave it as harmful, they would have to show that in some way they were harmed by this, when really it was apparent that, the supervisor just didn't complete their obligation.
Right, and we'd want people to come forward early, right? We wouldn't want a trainee, a supervisee to wait until the end of their, to bring it to the board. We'd want them to be able to report it to the board if I think there's potentially harmful. I think my supervision is not up to par. It's potential, it has the potential to not be adequate based on the following reasons.
I think
Such
just
as my supervisor's asking me to code all of our 10-minute sessions as hour long.
or just documentation that, we had a planned meeting every Monday morning and supervisor not in attendance,
I think that's where the professional conduct aspect too,
Mhm.
because it might be hard, or at least harder to demonstrate how somebody's been harmed, but anybody who said, yeah, if they're not there, or if they're not doing an adequate amount of supervision, would consider that unprofessional conduct. Regardless of whether the supervisee indicated that they were harmed by that.
I agree. And I think what Kari said kind of sums up all of that. I can't remember your exact words, but I hope that you do.
Unprofessional and or potentially harmful.
There you go.
And I believe the style they have us use probably frowns on and/ors, but I think if we just said unprofessional or potentially harmful, that would accomplish the same goal.
Sounds good.
Yes.
Okay,
Well, then the last item is item 51. And this is intentionally or negligently failing to file a report or record required by state or federal law, willfully impeding or obstructing the filing of a report or record required by state or federal law, or inducing another person to take any of those actions. The advisory committee discussed whether the word negligently should be changed. And the advisory committee expressed support for removing the terms intentionally or negligently and just having the language say failing to file a report or record required by state or federal law, and then the existing language would remain the same. So just wanted to verify that is your recommendation on this item. And so,
everybody okay with that?
Yes, I agree.
Yes.
Yes.
Good.
all right. Well, thank you again for all of your work on these. I know it has taken some time in several meetings, but I think it's gonna be really helpful. The last time that these were updated by your profession was back in 2008. So these will be some good, helpful changes, and we'll forward these recommendations to the board.
Any old business discussion on possible regulation for care of clients in crisis? Do we think we've covered that with the addition of that to the unprofessional conduct reg we just discussed?
I think we add some language on that, unless you have any other thoughts on.
Anybody, everybody okay with that?
Yes.
That takes us to continued discussion on psychometricians.
And in your packet of material, a couple members of the advisory committee have forwarded to me position descriptions for psychometricians. I appreciate you sending that information. And so that is available for your review to kind of give a little bit more context for some of the scope of individuals who are currently providing services under that terminology. And I know Josh had talked on this topic initially, and he's not present today, but just kind of wanted to forward these materials in case you had additional thoughts on this topic.
I did want to,
Go ahead.
sorry, Dave, wanted to add that the program director for the sexual predator program who sent this over to me encouraged pursuit of an official licensing or position certification for this when they had hired someone as a psychometrician. Because there was no official position, they had to add a number of duties to that person's job in order to get them at a decent pay scale. Because if they were to hire them just for that, it would not be at a competitive pay scale. So if there is an official certification statewide, that would make the process simplified to actually hire this person at a competitive pay scale for that position.
I also think if there was an actual job description, it would eliminate, possibly entirely, the question by others on what does and what does not qualify. And so, for organizations that are looking to hire, they're not concerned about running the risk of perhaps hiring someone that isn't qualified or doesn't meet, all the the requirements by the state board. Whereas if we had it laid out as far as this is what it is, and there was a license or certification of some degree, that might make it a little bit easier for entities to actually incorporate them into their companies.
I think a certificate might be reasonable. Right now, they're practicing under our licenses, right? And that's meaningful because it makes us professionally responsible for the quality of the work. So when they do collect the raw test data and score that data, then us as independently licensed folks or doctoral level psychologists are responsible for making sure that that work has been done appropriately. And so I think that's a great point. Do we want the responsibility to fall under the independently licensed professional? Or back to to what licensure board and what would we make the standard? I know we require a bachelor's degree in psychology or related field, but I'm guessing by Travis's comments that maybe it's the bachelor's degree may not be required or the pay scale wouldn't be so non-competitive.
Yeah, it seems like if you move in the direction of having this group licensed by the BSRB, then what that's going to require is some very rigid sets of educational and training requirements, right? Because you're saying the board is now saying this person is able to do this particular job, which means they've had this formal training. And
that might be overkill if you're just having them administer one singular test over and over again, as opposed to, learning how to administer 8 different batteries of tests.
And my assumption is there probably aren't many people coming out of bachelor's programs who've had training in actual administration of psychological testing. So
correct. We get most of ours from people who have completed a master's degree and not passed the EPPP or did it in another state and are having trouble getting licensed and ended up deciding they really love it and then never pursued the rest of they didn't have to pursue licensure because they ended up enjoying practicing at that level. And I assume some of that is near the model of the, the advanced practice registered nurse and the physician. If it's a good relationship, you're working together, you're feeling like you're part of a team. I mean, I wouldn't want to limit entities that rely on psychometrists to get really long wait lists of people waiting on tests done by making it really complicated to get licensed.
Which is exactly what I think happens if you ask the BSRB to create a license, right? Because that's what they have to do in order to demonstrate that they're protecting the public, is they have to say, we're going to have a standard. And when your job description says it could be a psychology major or it could be a social work major, then the issue is, what training would those people have to be able to do this? Because the BSRB has to be able to say to the public, we're protecting you because we have standards of training and education. And so that's automatically going to narrow that. And I think make it much harder for people to do exactly what you're saying, is to hire folks. Whereas if they practice under the license of somebody, then it's that person's responsibility to say, it's really my license at stake.
And there's some synergy with that, again, because you as the independently licensed person know what tests you're going to be used. And so you would train your psychometrists and make sure they're competent in those areas, as opposed to a wider net license, which you'd have to demonstrate competency in a variety of different tests. So I think keeping it flexible would be good for wait lists for patients across the state that are waiting for testing.
Leslie, as the licensing expert here, do you have feedback?
I don't, I mean, it would, I think that really I'm not in a position to say, I believe it would cause, just like with licensing, what you said, a backlog, and we'd have to have, specific requirements. And since it's not, I mean, this person, as far as I know from listening to you guys, this person isn't going to have come from a testing certification program or something like that. So their education could be all over the board.
I don't have a lot of experience with this. I don't work with psychometricians like Lauren does. My concern would be making sure they know, I mean, each test is so specific on, when you can prompt or when to question or when to ask more for follow-up, or, the ceilings and the basals and when to start and where to stop. But that would be the responsibility of the licensed person to make sure that they're trained. I have no idea what that would look like without going through a program. So I guess I defer to those of you that work with psychometricians, because I just don't have any experience with that. I think I would be a little concerned with the standardization of the test itself and making sure it stays true when it's given.
I could maybe share an example. So very, very long time ago, when I was doing my practicum, my clinical supervisor was a doctoral level psychologist. And while I went to Washburn, we have heavy in testing. I can really, really great do a Rorschach for you, which we'll never need to do again. But I was never taught how to do an RBANS. I didn't know. And so my clinical supervisor taught me, and she was a doctoral level psychologist, well-trained in administering it. And she was comfortable teaching me. And then she observed and watched, and then she, as the independently licensed person, interpreted that test, knowing that it was administered by a non-licensed person who was in training, and she supervised that. And I think to some extent we want in a workforce shortage area, especially, we want to give people the tools they need, and we want to trust our independently licensed folks to use people to the appropriate level of where their competency ends, or to make sure that there's a competent, and maybe that language could just be added. We would be
And how
responsible for
would you?
ensuring that the competency was met. And so
Yeah.
how would you?
Well, like
If
I'm
you're not
thinking,
competent in it, like if I'm not competent in it, then I would not be able to tell if someone else was. So I think that would be step number one.
but I'm thinking like a standard IQ test. If I'm learning how to do that or learning how to give that, and let's say I have built rapport with this child or adult or whomever, and then suddenly there's, I mean, how is this video recorded? Or, I can't imagine if there's another person in the room, that's going to throw my client off and make them maybe more nervous. I don't know. I'm wondering what that, and I think I'm trying to remember when I was in grad school, I think we had to videotape and practice with people who weren't, clients yet, just volunteers. So it wasn't, I don't know, just
so
it seems like a big feat, a big task.
It is. I mean, keeping competencies up for mid-level providers or people, that is a lot of work. It's going to be a lot of work. You as a trainee would always disclose that vulnerability to the patient, right? So you would say, I am a practicum student. At the time I said I'm a practicum student. I'm administering a new test. My clinical supervisor will be reviewing it closely afterwards, and just responsible for explaining the limitations. I don't think that's appropriate in every single setting. That's not how we would do things here at KU. We would make sure that we'd gone through the competencies we've defined for each of the different tests with each psychometrist we hire. But I don't know that that is reasonable on a small scale private practice or small group practice. And that we also know there's not time for independent providers to be doing all of the testing and still meet the community need. I'm a fan of of at least having some way for people to be found to have a competency to administer not complicated batteries of testing, but at least there are a number of tests that are very easy to administer, and someone could demonstrate that competency pretty quickly. And some of it is knowing your limitations. Again, if I have a psychometrist I'm not very confident in, maybe all I'm going to ask them to do is scoring. Maybe I'm administering and I'm watching them score and I'm training them until we get to the place where, when I'm rescoring it after them. It is a lot of work. And that's why they are paid at a low, to supervise them is a lot of work. And that's why they're not paid at an independent practitioner rate. But if we were to require a master's degree with testing experience, I don't know we would have any psychometrists left.
But it goes to the point, right, where the difference between a practitioner saying, I'm going to do these kind of evaluations, I'm going to have a need for somebody to do these parts of that, and they define it and they train and they risk their license, versus a state board trying to figure out a very global and prescriptive manner by which all applicants for that licensure would have to meet standards, right?
Right.
Regardless of whether they were doing 2 tests or 10 tests, and I think that's, if you're talking about whether this is going to make it easier or harder, in my mind, it seems like it's going to make it much harder.
I agree. I think the responsibility falls back to us as the independently licensed people anyways, right? At the end of the day, whether that person's certified or not, if we're signing off on reports not accurately administered and scored and interpreted, that's on us. So I like keeping the onus on each of us to protect our license by making sure competent and qualified care is provided.
So Dave, to your point, is this was an issue originally raised by Josh, and who's not here today. Maybe we can continue this discussion at our next meeting when he's back, because I know he sees that as a real need, but maybe with some further discussion around the complicated issues that it would create for BSRB to have to really develop an entirely new set of regs and educational requirements for such a group. You know, we can see whether this group thinks that it makes sense to continue down that path, or to say, really, that doesn't look like something that falls under BSRB as we see it at this point. So everybody okay with that? That we'll table it? Further discussion?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes,
I want to, we've got some additional items, and I want to make sure we have time before. So we'll move to new business. Discussion on reciprocity and license requirements, Dave.
Yes, so I spoke earlier about the board's offsite planning meeting on October 24th and how the board had asked the different professions to consider potential changes to the reciprocity statutes for their profession. So what I will go ahead and do is I will pull up a copy of, or actually you have in your packet a copy of the statute KSA 74-53 75. That is the reciprocity statute for the master's level psychology profession. And so that statute essentially says that for master's level psychologists who wish to get licensure through reciprocity from another jurisdiction, they would either need to, under A, be licensed in a jurisdiction that had essentially equivalent licensure standards, or they would need to meet the requirements in A2, in which it says they would need to demonstrate they have practiced master's level psychology for at least 48 of the last 54 months immediately preceding the application, with at least the minimum professional experience established by rules and regulations of the board. It also notes that they would need to show an absence of disciplinary action of serious nature and have at least a master's degree in psychology from a regionally accredited university or college. And as I discussed, that bill that passed concerning applicants that are military members and military spouses, and then individuals who reside in Kansas and those that intend to reside in Kansas, provided an alternate pathway for reciprocity. And what that statute says is that if someone doesn't meet the existing reciprocity statute, and they do qualify under that bill as one of those groups of individuals, then they could get licensure through an alternative reciprocity pathway, where they would primarily need to show that they had a similar scope of practice. They were licensed to perform services with a similar scope of practice to our licensees, and that they have practiced in that jurisdiction for at least a year. And then there's some other requirements that are lesser that involve a lack of discipline, but the main requirements are that they have practiced under a similar scope of practice and they've practiced for at least a year. So the existing statute really talks about practicing for 4 years out of a 4.5-year period. So it doesn't allow for there to be a little gap. But it is significantly longer than that new reciprocity pathway from that bill. And so a number of the advisory committees have met. They have discussed possible changes to this time frame for their professions. The the licensed psychology profession recommended dropping the length of time from 48 months down to 12 months. And they said 12 months out of 18 months. So they wanted to allow for a little bit of a gap there. The social work profession wanted to decrease the length of time from 48 months down to 12 months. They also recommended that if someone applies for licensure who has not practiced in that jurisdiction for 12 months, that they could apply to the board for provisional license and receive one of those while they were finishing the remaining months of practice in their jurisdiction to get a permanent license here. The addiction counseling profession and the marriage and family therapy profession, they both recommended that the amount of time be reduced to 0, so that as long as you are practicing in another jurisdiction with a similar scope of practice and you are licensed to practice there, and you have the other requirements such as the specific degree that is required in the reciprocity statute, that you would be allowed to practice here through reciprocity if you apply for that level of license. And I think part of the mindset on that was there's a number of multi-state compacts that are coming up. SIPAC, we started becoming a member of SIPAC this past year in 22. Now that's limited to just telehealth, but there's also that professional counseling compact that is likely to come before the legislature in 23. And it would be just for the clinical level of licensure right now. But there's also language for a social work multi-state compact that is in draft form, and they hope to have it available sometime during 2023. There have been conversations around a potential multi-state compact for marriage and family therapy. And so I think right now there's a significant interest in dealing with workforce issues. And so I just kind of wanted to summarize the discussions by the other advisory committees, and then originally the direction by the board to talk about this length of time. I did want to point out in this regular statute, it does talk about the requirements for those at the clinical level. That's under section B, and that has a different standard. You have to meet 2 of the following 3 requirements: either have graduate coursework as established by rules and regulations of the board, or passing a national clinical exam approved by the board, or 3 years of clinical practice with demonstrated experience in diagnosis and treating mental disorders, or 3, an attestation from a professional license to diagnose and treat mental disorders, an independent practice or license to practice medicine and surgery, stating that the applicant is competent to diagnose and treat mental disorders. But the real topic that the board was looking for the advisory committees to discuss was for that main length of time of 48 months for those master's level psychology applicants, or for the other professions, that level of non-clinical licensure, to see if that should remain at 48 months, or if that is something that you think may be helpful to reduce, if that's a recommendation you would like to make for the board. So wanted to bring that to you and see if you had any thoughts on proposed changes or possible changes to the statute.
And the current is 48 months, correct? Or no?
Yes, the current standard
Yes.
be 48 months out of the last 54 months immediately preceding applying for licensure by reciprocity.
I don't know how others feel, but it seems like if I can't remember what you said, if it was the social worker or whatever, but I like the idea that if it's been less time, like let's say I haven't started practicing yet, but my partner gets a job out of state, so we have to move. I like the idea of the provisional license instead of having to be separated, from my family. I don't know. I think this is I guess I'm not quite sure where the 48 months comes from, and if that's reasonable, if that's been an issue for people in the past. But I think if it's been less than that, I think applying for a provisional license with that state for those few years, to me, that makes sense.
This lady, you want to speak to that?
The 4 years was, initially it was 5 years, and then the board dropped it to 4 years to allow 2 renewal cycles before someone could come through reciprocity. And now that can be a problem now because people are so moving, and we often have people who haven't been practicing and licensed for 4 years.
There's also potentially an issue with this language in that it says you have to have practiced 48 months out of the preceding 54 months. So if you did practice for a long period of time and then you cease practicing for longer than the 6 months, that would not meet that standard. You would have to essentially reestablish those 48 months to be able to qualify for reciprocity under this statutory language. So,
And most of the other groups are moving to 1 year or none.
Right. Currently, there's been 4 advisory committees that have made recommendations, and 2 have recommended moving to a 12-month period of time. And then the other 2 recommended moving to drop that down to 0. So as long as you are licensed in another jurisdiction under a similar scope of practice and hold the appropriate level of degree, and you have a lack of disciplinary nature, then you would be able to apply for reciprocity and receive a license through that. So those still need to be voted on by the board, but those are the recommendations that are going to be forwarded to the board for the meeting tomorrow.
Can you confirm that the out-of-state license or that the license held out of state cannot be provisional?
Well,
Right, like if I am provisionally licensed, if I only have 1 license and it's provisional and it's in Virginia, I shouldn't be able to apply for anything more than I never even made it to a real license, a full license there. I'm just thinking if someone hopped a lot, you could go a long time without anyone ever looking to see if you meet criteria for full licensure.
so it would have to be an equivalent license.
Okay,
In other states, sometimes an LMLP would be a provisional in another state because they may have passed the exam, but they're still working on hours for the full level license or something. Because we have tiered licensure, not everyone does. So they have to have, if they apply for the LCP, they have to have an independent license in the other state.
okay. But, and if they had a T LMLP in the other state, they would only get a T LMLP here,
They,
or they,
or they'd have to file a standard application, yes.
okay. I have some reservation about provisionally licensed people qualifying for PACs. Until you've been at least licensed without your provisional license by 1 state.
But some states, that's the same thing. An LMLP in Kansas hasn't had any license, any hours of experience. So,
Outside of their practicum,
right, if they have the education and the exam, then that would be considered an equivalent license. If they haven't finished their education and exam, they wouldn't qualify.
right? But you can have a TLMLP in Kansas without passing the EPPP. And what I've seen is an issue of people who struggle passing their advanced licensure exam. With us, that's just the same exam, but the LPCs in particular seem to really struggle with it. And so we've hired people on provisional licenses and them not be able to end up getting licensed. And so I hate to put a patient in that situation where an organization is hiring someone that was only able to get provisionally licensed in their home state without something. So I as long as it would still be considered a T in front of it, if they had a provisional license, I just think that's important. It stays provisional.
Except that some states don't have a T, they have a provisional. And they may have, so an LPC, you have to have your education and you have to pass an exam.
Mm-hmm.
And then on top of that, if you want the clinical license, you have to have an equivalent license in the other state.
Mm-hmm.
So Missouri doesn't have an LPC and an LCPC. They just have an LPC provisional where they have to pass the exam and they have to show that they've had the proper education. So if the provisional license was equivalent to our LMLP, they could get an LMLP, but if it's not, then they could not.
Okay, but to get the LMLP, they would have still had to take the EPPP. I guess I have concern about people getting licensed as an LMLP or an LCP without taking the EPPP. I think that is a core to our profession. And I think that's something that employing lots of master's level clinicians over the years, I think there's something to be really proud of with what the mid-level psychology clinicians can do. And I think being prepared and having passed the EPPP at the doctoral level is an important part of that ability to practice and what sets our profession apart. But that's just my opinion.
So Lauren, do you feel like it's still helpful to have some time in there, maybe not 48 months, but 12 months would guarantee that the person would have full licensing past the EPPP?
That's what I was thinking, is that 12 months, like the doctoral level psychologist proposed, would be, I think I'd feel most comfortable with that one.
I just have to say something. If a person comes from another state and they've been practicing for a year or 4 years, however, whatever time frame, then if they've gotten in under that standard, they don't have to have passed the EPPP, which would affect people who've been licensed a long time, because not everyone that was licensed quite a while ago has taken the EPPP. So if the EPPP is a requirement, it could negatively affect people who've been practicing for a long time.
So Leslie, really part of the issue is a lot of states don't license master's level psychologists, and because there's not a overarching national accreditation, it really is state dependent. And if we make ours so restrictive, what we're essentially doing is not allowing people who've been practicing in a state under whatever that state's guidelines are, and then wanting to move to our state. What we're saying is, if they've got an equivalent license in that state to what an LMLP is, it's really just, at this point, we're looking at the amount of time that they've practiced.
Right.
So the real question at this point anyway is, do we think it needs to stay at the 48? Sounds like the other groups are going, that's probably going to eliminate a fair amount of people who may have worked in another state and whose spouses or whatever. And I think that was the intent of the legislation, right? That particularly those who are attached to military families who come into our state and then say, wow, I was practicing where I came from, now I can't get a license to practice here, which puts undue stress on my family.
I'm thinking if you're qualified, you shouldn't have. I'm wanting to make sure we can make sure everyone's qualified so they don't have to wait. Because if you can't go back and practice.
That's the issue of, there's not a national kind of benchmark like there is for most of the other groups, where they can move from state to state fairly easily, because once they have that, most states recognize it. But that may be coming. APA is looking at credentialing master's level programs, and if that happened, then there would be this, kind of across the board, it would be a lot easier to do this, right, Leslie?
Yes, exactly. There's no education standard for LMLP by a professional associate, accrediting body.
Okay,
So,
we're rapidly running out of time. Go ahead, Travis.
hopefully this isn't a very long question. The difference between getting reciprocity and then actually just applying for a license under our standards is, we're saying because they're licensed and practiced for so long, we're almost grandfathering them into our licensing without having to fully complete all of our requirements. Is that correct?
And by so long, that's currently defined as 48 months.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, well, that means, yes, that makes sense. Why we require 4 years of practice, because we're not going to require them to meet the standards that we have to when we get licensed here. They must be an experienced clinician.
So if a
Right.
woman has a child and stays home for 7 months, she will have to begin the 4 years and miss all the time that if she, practiced for 3 years and then took a year off, she'll have to go back and make up all that time, which is not.
Well, maybe
doable
there's a
anymore.
minimum that you have that makes how much needs to be compressed in that last 12 months less important, right? If I've been practicing, I think of when we created the LCP in Kansas, and the LMLPs that have been LMLPs forever were had the ability to get grandfathered in. And that was because they've originally qualified for the LMLP license here, and then you guys had a record of them practicing here. And I think that's what Travis is getting at. We want to make sure someone has a few years of practice under their belt and getting out of graduate school, starting a position, and then going out on maternity leave, and you may end up with only 3 months of practice in a 12-month period, but I don't think that should mean the board doesn't do a full review of your application. That's too few years, too little of experience to not go under a full review, in my opinion, in the absence of other quantifiable data like the EPPP or your whatever else is, all of the other requirements for the practicum that we wouldn't be checking to see what that looked like for them.
And what does the new reciprocity legislation tell us we have to do?
So the new reciprocity legislation, essentially you would need to be a military member, military spouse, someone who resides in Kansas, or someone who intends to reside in Kansas. And if you did fit into those groups, we would look at, if you applied for reciprocity, we would look to see if you qualify under the existing reciprocity statute. And if you don't, then you would be under that statute in terms of, we would look at to see, do you have a license with a similar scope of practice, and have you been practicing in that jurisdiction for a year? And then there's some other requirements as far as lack of disciplinary activity, and then paying the relevant fee. But it is a much quicker pathway for reciprocity.
So you said, is there anybody excluded by that language?
Yeah, so I think one of the things is if you have someone, let's say, for example, who lives in Kansas City, Missouri, but practices in Missouri and practices in Kansas and has no intention to move to Kansas, they are very much a Missouri resident, they would not be able to come over and get a license in Kansas through reciprocity unless they have practiced that whole length of time, because they don't, and assuming they're not a military member or military spouse. So do you have situations like that with bordering states, or for individuals who want to do telehealth in Kansas that wouldn't qualify? So I think there are individuals who wouldn't qualify under the bill. And this is also a comment too I wanted to share. I mentioned earlier, I've been in some of those legislative committees. I know the legislature has made comments to our board and directly through the committee meetings and others, that they are really focused on addressing workforce issues, and that they want they want the regulatory boards to have conversations on these matters. But they've also made comments that they are looking to also be somewhat aggressive at making changes to help more people be able to practice in Kansas. So I don't want that to overly influence your decision on this matter. I just want you to know those comments are out there. The legislature, I think, is interested in addressing some of these topics, but I think they wanted boards and advisory committees to discuss these things first to kind of see what would be appropriate for the profession, knowing that they could potentially change it further if they thought that was appropriate. So.
But as it stands, if somebody was planning to move to Kansas, the current rate no longer applies, because they could go under the new.
Well, according to that bill, you would still need to apply to see if they meet the existing statute. And then if they don't, then you would apply the other one.
So yes, it would, if you leave it at 4 years practice, the only people that would affect are people who want to practice in Kansas but don't live in Kansas. the other people would be able to go under the other law.
So just want to make sure everybody's clear on that, right? That this new legislation really bypasses what's currently in place. What's currently in place would only stand then for people who want to practice here. Obviously living in a border area, because this means coming over and doing practice, right? Not telehealth necessarily.
No, but it could be. We have a lot of people apply just for telehealth too. Not as much at the LMLP level, because not every state has it, but
Right. So it creates then kind of a double standard for how we look at people depending on whether or not they're coming to live in the state and practice, or whether, as Dave said, they live in Kansas City, Missouri, and they're going to practice on both sides of the line.
I have a question. So we've talked a lot in our meetings about what constitute in residence. And so, and because we're trying to get rid of some of the challenges in getting licensed, if I was one of those people stuck in one of those programs that we've been talking about, would I be able to go to another state and get licensed and then get reciprocity in Kansas in a way that creates a loophole that we've been trying to avoid by creating the other regulations? I mean, is that essentially just creating, maybe it'd be easier not to apply to get your license in Kansas, just go straight to an easier state and then ask for reciprocity? I want to make sure we're not encouraging that.
yeah. No, it is something that could be done, yes.
It's an unintended consequence of
Yeah.
this.
So then maybe the 12 months is that compromise, because it's not instantaneous. So it's not an easy button. You're going to have to do the work. I don't know.
I do think if it was 12 months, it would create some less confusion. Because I think when that bill was passed, a lot of people thought, well, now that 12 months will apply to everyone. And so our staff has spent a lot of time trying to explain some of the differences. And so if it was 12 months, it would seem more uniform with what that bill created for those other groups. And it would probably create some less confusion.
And assuming that your committee would do this, so as it stands, to come in through reciprocity, if you're at an independent level, which there aren't very many at the LCP level, but if you were to come to Kansas for reciprocity, you would have to do the equivalent license, and for the clinical level, they'd still have to show clinical coursework or the exam and 3 years of clinical, or 3 years of clinical experience, or the person's attestation from another clinically licensed person. So the clinical level still has additional requirements,
Okay.
but the bottom, the baseline is changing.
2 of those 3, right?
Yes, 2 of the 3.
So if they did come, they would still, as an LMLP, have to practice under somebody until they met those criteria, could apply for independent level of licensure.
Yes.
So that might help Lauren in terms of these people coming into the state would need to have practiced for a year, and as an LMLP would have to function under the ongoing supervision of someone or in a facility. Because like all LMLPs have to function under supervision, is that right?
Supervision or direction, yes.
So there's that. It's not like they could come in and throw up a shingle and do it. People comfortable with us then reducing that to 12 so that it's
Yes.
the same for everyone?
Yes.
I agree.
I really appreciate the conversation and want you to understand that that's what these folks here at the BSRB do every day, is struggle with kind of these things, trying to help people from other states understand very complex nature of the regs, rules, and statutes that we have in place. Right, Leslie?
Yes. Not just our statutes either. No, we have other states statutes that, you know, are added in there and make it more confusing.
I know we're a little over time, and I appreciate everybody hanging in there. Is there something quick we can do on the topics for 2023?
I just wanted to let the advisory committee know every spring we do training for advisory committee members. Also, there'll be an opportunity to discuss if you would like to have me send something out to individuals who are interested in maybe becoming new advisory committee members. So that is usually something that can take place in the spring. So that will be something coming up. But otherwise, there's a number of new topics that the advisory committee could look at, but those are all available. So.
And I think during our next meeting, we will discuss adding one more person to our advisory committee. That way, like today, we needed 5 out of 8, but if we had 9, you still only need 5, right? Just makes that a little easier. We know we changed these dates, so the difficulty people had in getting this on their schedules on us now. We really appreciate, as always, your time and your energy. Really, really good discussions today and a lot of good work done. Next meeting, you have February. Is that to get us back on our normal off-month schedule?
Yeah, the original date for this meeting was in December, and then they scheduled an additional legislative committee meeting at the exact time that we were going to be meeting. So that's why we had to move this meeting to January. But normally the advisory committee would meet in February and then 2 months later in April. So.
And we'll send out, can we do that?
I can do a poll.
Do a poll to look at some dates.
Awesome.
Thank you all very much. I would entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Second,
I second.
thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
2023.